The village of Ashenmore had no business burning on a Tuesday. Seraphina Veil pressed her back against the cold stone of the granary wall and watched the torches come down the hill like a procession of fallen stars. She had heard the stories every child in Ashenmore had of the creatures that moved through the mountain fog before winter came, collecting what they were owed. Her grandmother had called them the Tithe Lords. The old women of the village called them something worse. No one had ever said the king himself would come. But there he was. She saw him before she understood what she was seeing. He rode no horse. He walked through the parting smoke as though the fire owed him courtesy, his black coat falling to his ankles in precise, unmoving lines despite the wind. His face was difficult to look at, not because it was terrible, but because it was too composed, too still, as if each feature had been arranged by someone with centuries to spare and no tolerance for imperfection. Dark hair, pale jaw, eyes that caught no firelight and gave none back. The villagers had offered 3 barrels of salted grain and a chest of silver trinkets. Every autumn, that had been enough. This year, the coven's emissaries had arrived 2 weeks early to say it was not. Seraphina did not know what debt the village had incurred. She only knew that she had come to the granary to retrieve her father's ledger when the horses arrived, and now the doors were blocked, and the man, the creature, standing in the village square was speaking in a voice so low she should not have been able to hear it, but she heard every word. The bloodline agreed to terms 4 centuries ago. One of the line must stand before me before the first snow. You have delayed, you have substituted. The agreement does not allow for substitution. Elder Corwin, grey and trembling at the knees, spread his hands wide. My lord Cassius, there is no one left of that line. The Veil family, the last of them, is gone. We have searched. You have not searched the granary. The silence that followed was the kind that lives inside stone. Seraphina pressed her hand over her own mouth. Her heartbeat was suddenly too loud. A reckless, catastrophic sound, and she was certain, in the way one is certain of doom, that he could hear it. The granary door did not break. It simply opened, the iron bar bending outward with a sound like a quiet exhale, and then the cold came in. And with the cold came the king. He looked at her the way one looks at a document long searched for, not cruelty, not hunger. Pure, terrible recognition. Seraphina Veil, he said. Not a question, not an introduction, a notation. She did not answer. Her voice had gone somewhere she could not retrieve it. He tilted his head, and there was something in the gesture that was not entirely human, too precise, too patient, like a scholar marking a line in an ancient text. You are the last of the Veil bloodline. The covenant requires your presence in my household until the terms of your ancestors' debt are discharged. I don't know anything about a covenant, she managed. You are not required to. He stepped closer, and the torchlight finally reached him, and she saw that his eyes were not black as she had thought. They were a deep, bruised violet, the color of storm clouds just before lightning. You are required only to come. And if I refuse? Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not threat, something older, more exhausted. Then Ashenmore burns tonight. Not from vengeance, from the coven's law which I am bound to enforce as much as you are bound to obey it. A pause. I do not want to burn it. Seraphina looked past him at the village, at the torches, at Elder Corwin's bowed head and the children being hurried behind shuttered doors. She thought of her father's careful ledger. She thought of what it meant to be the last of a line, carrying a debt she had never agreed to. She set the ledger down on a green barrel. I'll need my coat, she said. He did not smile, but the rigid line of his jaw shifted, barely as though some tension had been released. It will be brought. They led her to a black carriage without ceremony, without chains. There was no need for chains. The village was behind her, and the fog was ahead, and the vampire king walked beside her without touching her, silent as a judgment already delivered. She did not cry. She looked once over her shoulder at the lamplit windows of Ashenmore, at the life she was leaving in the keeping of people who had given her over without a fight, and she turned forward and did not look again. Inside the carriage, the cold was absolute. Cassius sat across from her in the darkness and said nothing for a very long time. When the first mountain pass came and the village lights disappeared entirely, he spoke. "You will not be harmed in my house." "Is that a law?" she asked quietly. "It is a promise," he said. "I find those more reliable." She said nothing. She watched the dark forest swallow the road behind them and thought about the difference between a cage made of iron and a cage made of obligation. Both, in the end, were still cages. The first snow began to fall before they reached the mountain's crest. The estate was called Veilmir. Seraphina learned this not from Cassius, who had not spoken again during the entire mountain crossing, but from the woman who met them at the gate, a pale, severe creature named Meridian, who appeared to be approximately 60 years old and moved like something much older and much less forgiving. "The Veil girl," Meridian said, looking her over without warmth. "She's thin." "She is present," Cassius replied, with the tone of a man ending a conversation. "Give her the East Wing rooms, the ones with the fireplace." That was the last she saw of him that night. Veilmir was not a dungeon. This was the first thing Seraphina catalogued because it mattered, because she had spent the entire carriage ride constructing a picture of iron and darkness and despair, and the reality was confoundingly, almost insultingly different. The East Wing rooms had heavy brocade curtains and deep burgundy, a writing desk of polished mahogany, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and a bed with 4 posts and enough blankets to survive a war. There was also a lock on the door, from the inside only. She tested this twice before she believed it. Meridian brought a tray of food, actual food, warm bread and soft cheese and something that smelled of rosemary and broth, and set it on the desk without comment. "Am I a prisoner?" Seraphina asked. "You are a guest of the Covenant," Meridian said. "There is a distinction." "What is it?" "A prisoner is kept from leaving by force." Meridian straightened the tray with unnecessary precision. "A guest of the Covenant is kept by the understanding that leaving would constitute a breach, and a breach would have consequences for the people she left behind." A pause. The distinction is largely philosophical. Seraphina looked at the food and decided she did not have the energy for philosophy. She ate. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality, like pages in a book paused mid-sentence. She was given access to the library, an enormous, dust-scented cathedral of shelves occupying the entire north wing, and to the gardens, which were overgrown in the deliberate way of places that had been loved once and then abandoned to their own instincts. She was not followed, except by a distant, watchful attention she could feel but never locate. She did not see Cassius for 4 days. When she did see him, it was not arranged. She had gone to the library after midnight. She had developed a habit of waking at odd hours, the mountain silence being a different creature entirely from the village quiet she was used to, and she had taken a candle to the far shelves where the older texts were kept, crumbling spines and faded gold lettering. She was reading about the history of the mountain covens when she became aware that she was not alone. He was standing near the window, at the far end of the room, his back to her, looking out at the dark garden. He wore no coat, only a white shirt open at the collar, and the strangeness of seeing him without the armor of formality was enough to make her hesitate in the doorway. He did not turn around. "You read at night. I can't sleep. Most humans can't," he said, "in this house, for the first weeks." A pause. "It passes." She came further into the room because standing in the doorway felt cowardly, and she had decided somewhere in the granary at Ashenmore that she would not compound her losses by adding cowardice to them. She set her candle on a reading table and looked at him. "How long will I be here?" He turned then. The moonlight from the window fell across his face and made something of it that the torchlight had not. Made him look, briefly, like someone who had once been in the habit of feeling things and had trained himself out of it through long disciplined practice. "That depends on factors I am still calculating." "Can you be more specific?" "No." She pressed her lips together and chose a different approach. "The Covenant, my ancestor." "Which one?" "Your great-grandmother's great-grandmother." He moved away from the window and his passage through the room was entirely silent, the way deep water moves, purposeful and without friction. A woman named Alara Veil, who came to me in the winter of 1601 with a request I granted. The terms of repayment were bound to her bloodline. What did she ask for? He stopped at the far shelf and pulled a volume without looking at the spine, as though he had catalogued every book in this room by feel. That is a longer conversation. He set the book on the table beside her candle. Read this first. She looked at the cover. The Veil Accord. Terms and obligations. Written in a hand she almost recognized. When she looked up, he was gone. The door to the library had not opened or closed. He had simply ceased to be in the room, as quietly as a thought that dissolves before morning. Seraphina sat down at the table, pulled the book toward her, and began to read. Outside, the wind moved through the overgrown garden with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time. She told herself the cold in her chest was only the mountain air. She did not entirely believe herself. The Veil Accord ran to 47 pages, written in 3 languages and annotated in at least 2 more, and Seraphina read it 3 times before she was satisfied she understood it. Or at least, understood what she was permitted to understand without context. Alara Veil had come to Cassius, then newly installed as King of the Northern Coven following a war the Accord referred to only as the Sundering, seeking protection for her village during a period of rogue vampire activity. The covens had fractured. The older laws had broken down. Creatures without allegiance or restraint were moving through the human territories unchecked, and Alara, who had apparently been a woman of extraordinary nerve and very little patience for helplessness, had ridden to Veilmir alone and asked the Vampire King to extend his protection to Ashenmore. He had agreed. The price was access to the Veil bloodline. Not possession. Not servitude. Simply access, one member of the line, in each generation, to be available to the king for a period of no more than 1 year, for purposes the Accord described only as the fulfillment of a binding inquiry. Seraphina read this phrase 6 times. It told her nothing. She brought the book to dinner the following evening. Cassius was already at the table when she arrived. A long, dark dining room where the candelabras burned with a steady, windless flame and the place settings at one end were ludicrously formal for 2 people. He sat at the head reading correspondence and did not look up when she entered, but said, "Sit wherever you are comfortable." With the manner of a man who had given that instruction so many times it had become automatic, she sat 2 chairs to his left, not beside him, not far enough away to be a declaration. "The fulfillment of a binding inquiry," she said, setting the Accord open on the table. "What does that mean?" He set down his correspondence. "It means Alara Veil knew something, or carried something that was relevant to the Coven's stability, and she was unwilling to share it in full at the time of the Accord. The agreement allowed for that knowledge to be accessed through her descendants when and if it became necessary. Accessed how? He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned already to read his silences. This one was the kind that preceded a truth he found uncomfortable to deliver. There are those within the bloodline who carry inherited memory, not conscious knowledge. Something older. It surfaces through proximity, through certain conditions. He met her eyes for the first time since she had sat down, and she was struck again by that violet depth, that quality of immense, measured age. Your ancestor believed it would fully surface in one specific descendant. In me specifically. The blood runs differently in different generations. Some carry only the lineage, others carry what was stored in it. He set down the correspondence altogether. Alara believed the line would produce someone, eventually, in whom the stored memory would be complete. And you think that's me? I do not yet know. He picked up his correspondence again, but not, she sensed, because he was done with the conversation, more because the directness of looking at her required some effort he was being careful about. "That is why you are here. That is the inquiry. How do you determine it?" "Time," he said, "proximity, and when it is ready, the memory surfaces on its own." "That's reassuringly vague." "It is," he agreed, and something in his voice shifted. Not humor exactly, but the shadow of it, like the memory of a reflex that had fallen out of use. "I am aware that is insufficient. I am telling you what the process requires, because you deserve to understand what you have agreed to." I didn't agree to anything. Your ancestor did. I wasn't born yet. No. He set the correspondence down again and turned to look at her fully. And there was something in his expression that was not ancient, or composed or regal, something that looked, briefly, like regret. You are correct. And I am aware of what that means, what it costs a person to be handed a debt they did not accrue. A pause. I will tell you only that no harm will come to you from this process, and that I have kept every promise made to the Veil bloodline for 400 years. Seraphina looked at him. She thought of her father's careful ledgers. She thought of Alara Veil riding alone up a mountain to bargain with a vampire king, and what kind of courage that required, and what it meant to be descended from a woman like that. What memory does the blood carry? She asked quietly. What did my ancestors store in it? The location of something lost, he said. Something that, if it remains lost, will eventually cost a great many lives. Whose lives? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, human ones, yours included. The candles burned between them. Outside the tall windows, the mountain wind moved through bare trees with the sound of distant voices. All right, Seraphina said. She picked up her fork. Then let's find it. She did not look at him again, but she heard it. Barely, beneath the silence, something that might, in a human man, have been the release of a long-held breath. It happened in the library 6 days later, on a morning when the snow had sealed the windows in white, and the candles were the only light in the room. Seraphina had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf. She had been working through the Coven histories methodically, which she suspected Cassius had intended, when the step of the reading ladder shifted beneath her. She grabbed the shelf. The shelf held, but the edge of it caught her palm in the catching. A sharp, clean line across the heel of her hand, and the blood came immediately, bright and sudden, and she pressed her fist closed and thought only of the book. She found it. She climbed down. Cassius was at his desk at the far end of the room, and he had been still for so long she had stopped thinking of him as present in any active sense. He was simply part of the room, the way the fireplace was part of the room, but now she became aware of him with a physical sharpness, the way you become aware of a change in air pressure before a storm. He was not moving. He was not looking at her. Every line of his body was controlled, composed, precisely what it always was. But his pen had stopped moving. Seraphina wrapped her hand in the hem of her sleeve and said nothing. She brought the book to the reading table and opened it and stared at the page without reading it, because her heart was doing something strange and fast, and she did not entirely know why. You should see Marin about that, he said. His voice was entirely even. Perfectly even. The way a voice is perfectly even when a great deal of effort is being put into making it so. It's small, she said. Yes. She looked at him then. He had set the pen down and was looking at the window. At the sealed white, his jaw was set. There was a stillness about him that was different from his usual stillness. This one had tension in it, invisible and taut, the way ice has tension before it cracks. Cassius, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly, and she felt the weight of it as she said it. He turned his head. She held out her wrapped hand. Is this a problem? He was across the room in less time than thought allows. Not with supernatural speed, but with the efficiency of someone who had stopped pretending to be slow. He stopped 3 feet from her. He did not reach for her hand. He stood in the way a man stands when he is very deliberately not doing something. It is not a danger, he said low. Not to you. But something is happening. Yes. She unwrapped her sleeve from her palm and held her hand between them. The cut was shallow, already slowing. In the candlelight, the blood was the precise deep red of old roses. He looked at it, and something happened to his face. Not hunger, not the thing she had braced for. Something more complex and more troubling. His eyes changed, not the animal dilation of desire, but something deeper, structural. Like a window opening in a sealed room. What are you seeing? She asked quietly. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. A woman on a road. Mountains behind her. She is carrying something wrapped in cloth. long and thin like a blade or a key. He blinked, and the vision broke, and he stepped back. Alara, the name sat between them. "You saw her?" Seraphina asked. "Through your blood." He turned away, moving back toward his desk, and the distance between them was restored. But something had changed in the room's atmosphere. Some seal had broken, some quiet that had been kept by mutual agreement, now suddenly insufficient. The blood memory is present. It is beginning to surface. What was she carrying? I don't know yet. He sat. He picked up his pen. He did not begin writing. I saw only the road, the beginning of a scene. His voice steadied itself through what was clearly conscious effort. It will come in fragments. It will require further proximity. Proximity to my blood. Yes, the word had the texture of something he did not want to say and said anyway, precisely because of that. Seraphina wrapped her hand again. She thought about what he had told her at dinner. The lost thing, the cost of it remaining lost, the human lives at stake. She thought about Alara Veil in her long ride up the mountain and what it meant to carry something in your blood that wasn't your own. "Then we should continue," she said. He looked at her across the length of the library. Something moved through his expression. Not warmth yet, but the possibility of it, like the first shift in a landscape before spring arrives. "I will not take what is not offered," he said. "That is a law I made and have not broken." "I know," she said. "I'm offering." She went back to her book and read without taking in a single word. Her hand had stopped bleeding. Her pulse had not stopped its strange, unsteady rhythm, and she decided that this was simply the consequence of proximity to ancient things, that the body registered what the mind was still catching up to. She told herself this quite firmly. The fire in the hearth burned very low, and neither of them moved to tend it. He did not sleep. He had not slept in 600 years. Had not required the surrender of consciousness, since the night his maker had pressed ice-cold hands to either side of his face and drained the mortality out of him by degrees, and he did not miss it. Tonight, however, he stood at the window of his study and wished for the first time in a very long while that he could. The vision had not left him. He had seen Alara Veil as she had been in life, her dark hair and careful eyes, the determined set of her jaw that her descendant had inherited so precisely it was almost unbearable, and he had seen what she carried. He had not told Seraphina everything. He had told her it was long and thin like a blade or a key. What he had not said was that he recognized it, that he had seen it before, in another vision, in another lifetime, in the hands of the woman who had made him. The sable Meridian. A seal, not a weapon. 400 years ago, during the Sundering, it had been lost in the chaos of the Coven Wars, and without it, the older binding law that kept the rogue covens in check had no foundation, no anchor. He had been searching for it in quiet, careful ways for centuries. He had followed dead ends and false trails in the wrong bloodlines for so long that the searching had become simply another part of his existence, neither hopeful nor hopeless, only ongoing. And now, he pressed his hand flat against the cold glass and thought about the girl sleeping 3 floors below him, and the blood she carried, and the way she had said, "I'm offering," with that same steady calm her ancestor had used to ride alone into a vampire's court. The Valas had always been more than they appeared. That was the nature of the bloodline. The inheritance was quiet, invisible from the outside, and then one generation would arrive who carried all of it at once, compacted and bright as a coal before it burns. He had suspected Seraphina from the moment he had confirmed she was the last of the line. The Coven records had been specific. The final daughter will carry the whole. He had not wanted it to be true, not because the discovery was unwelcome, but because of what it meant for her, what it meant to carry 400 years of stored memory, and what would happen when it fully surfaced. He did not know if it would hurt her. He did not know many things he had once known with certainty. And that too was her fault, in ways he was not prepared to examine. Seraphina, she dreamed of a road she had never walked. Mountains on every side, sharp and cold, and she was not herself in the dream, or rather, she was herself. But she was also someone else, someone older and more frightened and more determined, and she was carrying something that pulled at her arms with a weight beyond its size. She woke before she could see what it was. Marin was at her door, not knocking. Marin never knocked, which Seraphina had decided was either a deliberate power display or simply a very old habit, but standing in the open frame with a look of careful assessment on her lined face. "He wants you in the east garden," Marin said. It was early, barely past dawn, the mountain light gray and precise. Seraphina dressed and went. The east garden was the one she had walked in her first days at Veilmir. Overgrown, yes, but with a melancholy order beneath the wildness, roses gone to thorn, boxwood hedges grown past any intended shape, a stone fountain dry for what might have been decades. She found Cassius standing at the center of it, looking at the fountain, and she stopped a short distance away and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said, without turning around. "All right." The object Alara was carrying in the vision. He turned then, and his face in the cold morning light was not composed in the way she had grown accustomed to. There was something open in it, something deliberately unguarded, and that openness was more unsettling than any amount of control would have been. "I have seen it before. I know what it is." "What is it?" "A seal called the Sable Meridian. It was used during the Sundering to bind the most dangerous of the rogue covens. Not destroy them, bind them, contain them beneath law that required the seal to maintain its force." He paused. "When it was lost, the binding weakened. It has been weakening for 4 centuries. 3 years from now, it will fail entirely." Seraphina stood very still. "And when it fails, the contained covens are released. They are old, they are hungry, and 400 years of containment does not make ancient things gentle." She thought about this. She thought about Ashenmore, about the children behind the shutters, about every human village on every mountain road, and Alara hid the seal in her bloodline. She encoded its location in her blood and gave it into the keeping of her line. She trusted that the blood would eventually produce someone strong enough to carry it to its completion without breaking. He held her gaze, and there was something in his that she could not name, something that was not calculation and not strategy. She trusted that I would be patient enough to wait for that person. 400 years is a long wait, yes. Something crossed his face. She knew that too. Seraphina looked at the dry fountain, at the thorned roses, at this ancient creature standing in a dead garden with the weight of centuries on him, and the patience of something that had long since made peace with the weight. She thought she understood something, then, about what it meant to keep a promise across centuries, to tend an obligation in the quiet years when no one was watching, and the keeping of it cost you more than anyone would ever know. "What happens when the memory fully surfaces?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "You will know where the seal is. And then?" "And then," he said, "we retrieve it together. And then you go home." She nodded. She looked at the dry fountain for a long time. "That sounds simple," she said. "It is not," he said. They stood together in the dead garden while the mountain morning came fully into itself, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them had changed in some way that could not be changed back. The visions came more frequently after that, not always through blood. Sometimes they came at the edge of sleep, rising up in the quiet hours when the mountain settled and Veilmir breathed its slow, cold breath. Seraphina would surface from them with her heart hammering and her hands reaching for something she couldn't name, and she would lie in the dark and try to hold the fragments before they dissolved, a forest of black trees, a river that ran south before it turned, a hollow in a hill with a door of stone and a lock of bone, a woman kneeling in the snow with her hands cupped around something that pulsed with cold light. She began writing them down. Cassius found her at the writing desk one evening with 4 pages covered in her small, careful handwriting, and he stood in the doorway of the library and looked at the pages the way a man looks at something he had been afraid would not arrive. "May I see?" he asked. She handed him the pages without comment. She watched him read them, and she watched his face as he read, and she saw the moment he reached something significant, a slight tightening around his eyes, a stillness that was different from his habitual stillness. "The river that runs south before it turns," he said. "I know that river. Where does it go?" "Into the Veil Range, east of here. 3 days by foot." He set the pages down with great care, as though they were old and breakable. I have searched the Veil range many times. You didn't have the rest of it, she said. No. He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not gratitude. He was too restrained for gratitude to sit openly on his face, but it was something adjacent to gratitude, something that acknowledged a debt in the way the Accord acknowledged debts, precisely and without diminishment. Seraphina, he said, and then he stopped. She waited. I want you to understand, he said carefully, that what is happening to you, what the blood is doing, it is not a passive experience for the one who carries the memory. As the visions increase, the boundary between your own knowledge and your ancestors becomes permeable. You may feel things that are not yours. You may remember events you were not present for. That's already happening, she said. He was quiet. How long? Since the dream about the road. She smoothed the pages on the desk. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it was significant. Everything is significant, he said, and there was an urgency beneath the control, barely contained. From now on, you tell me everything. Whatever you see, whatever you feel that does not belong to you. Everything. She looked up at him. He was standing very close without having moved. The distance between them had contracted somehow, in the way that distances contract between people who have stopped pretending that distance is comfortable. Why does it matter? She asked. Because if the memory surfaces too quickly, before the mind is prepared to contain it. He stopped, started again. It has happened before, in earlier generations. One of the intermediate Veilus, your grandmother's mother, began receiving the visions and had no context, no one to help her manage the surfacing. The weight of it. He looked away. She did not survive the year. The room was very quiet. You should have told me that earlier, Seraphina said. Yes, he said. He did not offer an excuse, and she respected him more for it. I was calculating how to do so without causing unnecessary fear. I prefer unnecessary fear to unnecessary ignorance. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not the shadow of humor this time, but something warmer. Something that lived deeper. I will remember that. She held his gaze for a moment and felt the strangeness of it, the intimacy that builds between people who have only shared proximity and honesty, and the quiet weight of an ongoing thing. How it accumulates without announcement, how it arrives before you have named it. Tell me what to do, she said. Let me be present when the visions come, he said. My presence, my specific presence, acts as an anchor for those who carry the blood memory. I was designed into the Accord that way. Alara was thorough. He paused. It will require you to trust me. I already trust you, she said simply. It was the truest thing she had said since she arrived at Veilmir, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it, but it remained in the room long after the candles had burned low and Cassius had gone, careful and silent, back to his own wing. Seraphina pressed her hand flat over the pages of visions. Somewhere in her blood, Alara Veil was trying to tell her something, and she was going to listen. They came on the 9th day of the 2nd month without announcement. Seraphina was in the garden when the gates of Veilmir opened, and 3 carriages arrived, black and unmarked and carrying within them a delegation of the Southern Coven that had not. Marin informed her with unusual brevity, then invited. She was brought inside. She was told to remain in the East Wing. She did not remain in the East Wing. She found a corridor behind the library that ran parallel to the Great Hall, and she stood behind the carved screen there and listened to what she was not meant to hear. There were 4 of them. She could not see their faces clearly through the latticed wood. Only the shapes of them. The formal dark clothing, the particular stillness that marked very old things. They stood in the hall where the fireplace burned, and Cassius stood before them with his hands behind his back. And the one who spoke first had a voice like poured gravel. The human girl, the Veil descendant, is under the protections of an existing Accord, Cassius said. As you know, we are not here to debate the Accord. We are here to discuss what she carries. The blood memory is active. Our instruments registered it 6 days ago. If she surfaces the full memory, she will know the location of the Meridian. That is the purpose of the Accord. The Accord was written to benefit you, Cassius, not the Coven. not the law. The gravel-voiced one moved, and she caught a glimpse of his face, very pale, very old, with eyes the color of old coins. The Southern Coven has its own interest in the Sable Meridian. Its recovery must be a coven matter, not an individual one. The Accord gives me authority over the Meridian's retrieval. That Accord is 400 years old. Coven law has evolved. Coven law, Cassius said, and his voice was ice, does not evolve around the edges of specific binding agreements. If you have come to renegotiate the terms of the Veil Accord, you have come incorrectly. If you have come to make a threat, you should know that I have not become less than I was when I made this covenant. A long silence. We are not threatening, said a second voice, smoother, younger sounding. We are advising. The girl should be brought before the full council before the memory surfaces. The location of the Meridian should be received in Coven presence, not in private, so that the Southern Coven can control where the seal is returned, Cassius said. No answer, but the shape of the silence was an answer. Seraphina pressed herself against the cold stone and thought, with great clarity, about what it meant that 4 ancient creatures had traveled 3 days to make certain they were present when the knowledge inside her blood arrived. She thought about what it meant to be a vessel for information that other people wanted badly enough to break old laws for. She thought about Cassius, standing alone before them, and the way his voice had not altered by a single degree. After the delegation departed, they were given rooms in the West Wing, which was the coldest and most remote part of the estate, which she suspected was deliberate. She came out of the corridor and found him waiting. He looked at her without surprise. "How much did you hear?" "All of it." He nodded. "Then you understand why I am going to ask you something you may not want to do. You're going to ask me to let the memory surface before they expect it." He studied her. "That is exactly what I'm going to ask. If we retrieve the Meridian before the Council is involved, then its return is governed by the original Accord and not by Southern Coven politics." "Yes, that sounds dangerous." "It is." He met her eyes. "It is also the only way to ensure the seal is returned correctly. The Southern Coven's interest in the Meridian is not preservation, it is leverage." A pause. "I need you to trust me further than I have any right to ask." She thought about the visions. She thought about the black forest and the river and the hollow in the hill. She thought about a woman kneeling in the snow with her hands cupped around cold light. "I'll need you present," she said. "You said it requires your presence." "Yes." "Then we do it tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face had moved past restraint entirely. Something that was not calculation and not strategy. Something that had been living quietly beneath both of those things for weeks, careful and patient and entirely real. "Seraphina," he said very quietly, "if this becomes too much, I'll tell you," she said. "I told you I would tell you everything. I meant it." Outside, the mountain wind shook the old windows in their frames. In the West Wing, 3 members of the Southern Coven settled into cold rooms and waited for the morning. They would not get what they came for. He came to the library at midnight. She was already there. The candles lit, the pages of visions spread across the reading table. She had worn the warmest thing she owned, which was a gray wool dress with a high collar, because she did not know what the process would cost her physically, and she intended to face it with some dignity. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her in the candlelight, and she saw him do it. She saw him look, in a way he had been careful not to before, and she looked back without pretense, and the honesty of that mutual acknowledgement was more intimate than any touch could have been. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," she said, "but we should do it anyway." He came to the table. He sat across from her, not beside her, and folded his hands on the surface with the composure of a man preparing for something that would require everything he had. "The process," he said. "I need you to understand what I'm asking. You need to be in contact with my blood." "Yes, a small amount. Enough for the memory to bridge through." His eyes were on her face, not her hands. "I want you to understand that I am asking for something I have not asked for from a human in over 2 centuries, and that I understand exactly what it means that I'm asking." She looked at him. She thought about all the things that had built up in the weeks of shared silence and shared candlelight and shared honesty. The trust that had formed without ceremony, the thing that had been growing in the quiet and was now too large to be contained by the room. "I understand," she said. She turned her palm up on the table between them. He took the small blade from his coat pocket, silver, old, already clean. He held it above her palm. "One cut. It will be quick. I know." The cut was quick. The blood came, and before she could press it closed, his hand was beneath hers, his fingers curling around the heel of her palm with a careful, total gentleness that was entirely at odds with everything she had imagined about what this moment might be. His eyes closed, and then the room fractured. She felt it from the inside. The memory opening like a door she hadn't known was in a wall she'd been standing beside her whole life. It was not pain. It was pressure, enormous and structured, like a symphony that had been compressed to silence for 400 years, suddenly allowed to play. She saw Alara on the road. She saw the object she carried. She saw the forest and the river and the hollow in the hill, and she felt the precise coordinates of the place etched into her with the permanence of something that had always been there. And then she felt something else. She felt him, not as an intrusion, but as a counterweight, a hand on the other side of the pressure, keeping her from being pulled entirely under. She felt 4 centuries of him, the shape of his waiting and his patience and the grief he had kept locked beneath the composure, the ancient loneliness of a being who had outlasted everything he had ever loved and kept going because the work required it. She felt all of it in an instant, and it was not her knowledge, but she carried it now anyway, the way you carry a thing that was handed to you in a moment of great need. When she surfaced, she was shaking. His hands were still holding hers. He was leaning forward across the table, and the distance between them was nothing, and he was looking at her with an expression that had no armor left in it. "Are you here?" he asked. "I'm here. The location, I know it." Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. 3 days east, the river that turns south, the hollow hill, a stone door. "I know exactly." She looked at him. "Did you feel what I felt?" He was very still. "Yes." "Then you know I felt yes." His voice was low, careful, and entirely honest. "I know what you felt." She did not pull her hands away. He did not let go. "That was not supposed to be part of the process," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it happened anyway." The candles had burned down to almost nothing. The mountain was very dark and very quiet, and the Southern Coven delegation was asleep in the West Wing, and none of that mattered at all in the immediate, complete reality of this moment. "Seraphina," he said, and her name in his voice was something entirely different than a notation. "I know," she said quietly. Neither of them said anything else. But when she finally rose to leave, his hand released hers with the specific slowness of something that did not want to let go, and that, in its wordless truth, was answer enough for what neither of them had yet said aloud. They left before dawn. Marin packed provisions without comment, which meant she had either expected this or accepted that objecting would be pointless. Seraphina wore her heaviest coat. Cassius wore nothing heavier than he ever did, which she had decided was simply the prerogative of something that did not experience cold in any normal way. They took no one else. The first day's travel was through the high forest, where the snow lay in precise blue shadows between the trees, and the silence was deep enough to feel intentional. He knew the terrain, which she had expected, but the knowledge was intimate in a way that surprised her. Not the knowledge of a creature who had moved through this landscape with purpose, the knowledge of someone who had spent long, solitary hours in these particular trees, in this particular light. She asked him about it at the midday rest when they had stopped at a frozen stream and she was warming her hands over a small fire. "You come here often," she said. "I used to." He was looking at the trees, not at her. "In the early centuries, before the coven work became all-consuming, there is a particular quality of quiet in this range that is—" He stopped. "I have not been here in 40 years. "Why not?" "Because solitude and loneliness are different things," he said, "and I had confused them for a very long time, and at some point the forest stopped being a remedy." She looked at him. The firelight was different from candlelight, warmer, less controlled, and it made him look like something she had not fully allowed herself to see before. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said with a careful deliberateness, "it is bearable again." She turned back to her hands and the fire and did not push further, but she carried the words with her for the rest of the day's walk. On the second day, he told her about Alara. Not the accord, not the terms, the woman herself. He described her with the particular clarity of someone who had held the memory of a person for 400 years and gone over it enough times to know every detail. The way she had argued, her complete refusal to accept that impossibility was a permanent state rather than a temporary obstacle. The specific quality of her courage, which was not bold but relentless, the courage that simply kept going past the point where stopping would have been reasonable. "She sounds like you," Seraphina said. He glanced at her. "I have thought the same thing. Were you—" She stopped, started again. "Was she important to you?" "She was the first human I had spoken to as an equal in over a century," he said. "She was important to me the way significant things are important to people who have had very few of them." A pause. "I did not love her. I want to be clear about that, but I was grateful to her in a way that outlasted the debt." Seraphina nodded. She thought about what it meant to be grateful to someone for 400 years, to tend that gratitude in the long quiet of an immortal life. She thought about what it meant that he had told her this. On the third day, they found the river that ran south before it turned. The hollow hill was exactly as the visions had shown it, a fold in the earth, dense with old root growth, with a door of stone set into the hillside that might have been mistaken for a natural rock formation by anyone who hadn't been shown it in a blood memory 400 years in the making. There was a lock of bone, exactly as she had seen. She reached forward and placed her still healing palm against it. It opened. Inside, on a shelf of natural stone, sat an object wrapped in faded cloth. Small, dense, pulsing with a faint cold light that was not light exactly, but the impression of light, the sense of something contained, pressurized, waiting. Cassius took it from the shelf. He unwrapped it with the care of someone handling a thing that had cost more than objects usually cost. It was a cylinder of dark metal, engraved along its entire surface with script she couldn't read, sealed at both ends with something that looked like compressed shadow. "The sable Meridian," he said very quietly. She looked at it in his hands. She looked at his face. She watched something release in him. Not relief, exactly, but the letting go of a tension that had been held for so long it had become structural, had become part of the architecture of how he moved and stood. 400 years, she said. 400 years, he agreed. She looked at the object and then at him, and she thought about everything that had led to this moment. Alara's courage and her blood, and her careful encoding of a secret in the one place she trusted to keep it safe. The long decades of Cassius's patient, solitary searching, the granary at Ashenmore, and a ledger and a girl who had decided in the moment of her capture not to compound her losses by adding cowardice to them. "Cassius," she said. He looked at her. "What happens now?" she asked. Not about the seal, not about the coven. She meant something else, and they both knew it. He wrapped the Meridian carefully and held it against his chest, and looked at her in the cold light of the hollow hill, with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on an end. Immortal face. "Now," he said, "we return. And then I will ask you something that I have no right to ask." "You can ask," she said. "I told you. I prefer honesty to anything." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was closer than she had ever seen. "Not yet," he said. "When we are home." She did not know when Veilmir had become the word home in her mind, but she had used it, and she did not take it back. They returned to Veilmir on the 4th day. The Southern Coven delegation was still in residence. They were waiting in the great hall when Cassius entered, and the gravel-voiced one looked first at his hands, where the cloth-wrapped shape of the Meridian was clearly visible, and his ancient face did something complicated. "You found it," he said. "We found it," Cassius replied. The distinction was deliberate and noted. The council has no authority over the Meridian's return. The Veil Accord is explicit. Retrieval and reinstatement are the sovereign right of this coven and no other. He set the Meridian on the long table between them. I will reinstate it in the sealing vault tonight. The binding will be restored by morning. The contained covens will remain contained, and the law that governs them will hold. The gravel-voiced one's expression had gone very still, and the girl, Cassius said, has fulfilled the terms of the Veil Accord. She is free. The delegation remained in the great hall for another hour, speaking in low, formal voices about coven law and precedent and the rights of the Southern Coven, and Cassius stood before them with the patience of someone who had been arguing with committees of ancient creatures for 6 centuries and had not once been moved by the quality of their displeasure. By the end, they had taken their objections and their cold rooms and their elaborate carriages and departed back down the mountain road, and Veilmir was quiet again. Seraphina was in the library when he found her. She had been sitting with a book open on her lap and not reading it, watching the fire, thinking about the walk back through the winter forest and all the things that had been said, and more particularly about the things that had not yet been said. He sat down. Not across the table this time. Beside her. "The accord is discharged," he said. "You may leave tomorrow if you choose. I will have a carriage arranged and an escort. Ashenmore should receive you before the end of the week." She looked at the fire. "You said you would ask me something." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "I find that now I am here, it is more difficult than I anticipated." "You've been alive for 600 years, she said. "You have made binding covenanters with ancient creatures and argued coven law before delegations of hostile immortals." "Yes. And this is difficult." "Yes," he said. And then, because honesty had been the currency between them from the beginning, because those things required only certainty, and what I wish to say to you requires something I have not required of myself in a very long time. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes, and there was nothing guarded in his now. None of the architecture of restraint, none of the ancient composure that he wore so naturally, just the thing itself, clear and irreversible. "I am not asking you to stay," he said carefully. "That is not what I want to ask. What I want to ask is whether, when you return to Ashenmore and recover your life and whatever comes next, you will consider that the door here is not closed." He paused. "I have spent 400 years keeping a promise made to your ancestor. I would like, if you are willing, to begin keeping one made to you." Seraphina looked at him for a long time. She thought about the granary and the carriage and the cold east wing room on the first night, and everything that had grown from those beginnings in the long library mornings, and the quiet dinners, and the shared candlelight and the blood memory, that had given her 400 years of him in an instant, and left her knowing things she hadn't asked to know and couldn't wish away. "What would that promise be?" she asked quietly. Something moved through his face. "Whatever you want it to be," he said. "That is the point." She looked at the fire. She thought about what she was going home to. Her father's ledger. The village that had given her away without a fight. The life she had left in a cold granary on a Tuesday. She thought about this house, and this man, and the overgrown garden that wanted tending, and the library full of books she hadn't read yet. "I'm going to go home," she said. He nodded. He did not look away. "And I'm going to make sure my father's house is in order," she said. "And that Elder Corwin understands that the accord is discharged and Ashenmore owes nothing further. And I'm going to take some time to be myself without a blood memory pressing at the edges of my sleep." "Of course," he said. "And then," she said, "when I'm ready, I'm going to come back." The room was very still. "You should know," he said, after a long moment, "that I have no idea what to do with that." "With someone choosing to return?" "I know," she said. "I think that's all right." He looked at her, just looked at her, with the whole unguarded truth of 6 centuries on his face. And she looked back, and outside the mountain wind was gentling, the way it does when the worst of winter has passed, and the season is preparing, slowly and without announcement, to become something else. She did not kiss him. She was not ready for that yet, and he was not the kind of person who would ask for it before she was, but she reached across and pressed her uncut hand over his on the arm of the chair. and he turned his palm up and held it, careful and complete. And they sat together in the library as the fire burned and the mountain breathed, and 400 years of waiting became, finally, something other than waiting. 3 weeks later, a carriage arrived in Ashenmore, carrying Seraphina Veil and a letter bearing the seal of the Northern Coven, which declared the debt of the Veil family discharged in full, with the further notation, in a controlled, precise hand that she recognized, that the house at Veilmir would welcome correspondence of any kind, at any time, for as long as the author of that hand remained in residence, which, as everyone in the mountain range knew, was going to be a very, very long time.